We did our work in a very unique way. We know that. We allowed the survivors to come forward and to talk to us, to be able to listen to their stories without being questioned, without being cross-examined, to be able to tell their truth as they were best able to do that. Those who could say so publicly, we allowed them to do that. Those who needed, because of the burden of the pain that they carried for so long, needed to do it privately, we also gave them that opportunity and recorded those stories. And for each and every survivor who came forward and talked to us, we offered them a copy of their full testimony so that they were able to have it in video format, so that they, when they were ready, could share that with their children, with their grandchildren, with members of their family, so that when the most important act of reconciliation to survivors was opportunistic for them, they could sit down with their families and talk about how residential schools impacted them and engage in a process of reconciliation with their children and with their grandchildren. Because for many survivors, that was the only reconciliation that they were looking for. And we wish them well, those who are still engaging in that process, that will go forward. They were invited to share what they had to share, no more and no less, and their stories were recorded into history. All of their stories have now become part of the record of activities of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and will forever be archived along with those documents we have been able to get our hands on and will always be acknowledged. But in addition to that, we have invited artists and musicians to be a part of the reconciliation process as well. And I hope you will take the time to explore their works and to be able to receive one of the CDs of music that we have prepared from those who have donated their music to the Truth and Reconciliation Indian Residential School Music Project, because they wanted you to hear what it is that they had to say and express in the way that they could best do it, through music. Starting in 2008, this commission has collected now millions of documents. We have visited over 300 communities throughout this country, traveling from coast to coast, and we have heard and recorded the testimony of over 7,000 people. It is a commission like no other. No other commission has ever done work of that magnitude. One of our researchers says this is the largest oral history project in the history of Canada. And in the course of listening to the testimony of the survivors, we heard of the effects of over 100 years of residential schools, of over 100 years of mistreatment of the children who went to those schools, 150,000 at the very least, and maybe more. First Nations children, Inuit children, Métis children were placed in those schools. We received statements from individuals who had been removed from their communities, sometimes for many years at a time, without seeing their family during that time, and who are forced to attend those schools, and sometimes were forced or called upon or required to become married to somebody else in the school before they were allowed to return home, because the schools did not want one of their Christianized children to marry a pagan back in their community. We also heard from those who worked in the schools and who can now see from the experience of the survivors and from their own recollection that the schools were destructive of Aboriginal languages and cultures, and who have expressed their regret to us at being part of such destruction. We heard the pain of those people who worked in the schools, who were charged with the care of the children, and who were unable, despite their best efforts, to care for them properly or to protect them from the pedophiles and the abusers. We heard from the families and the loved ones connected to survivors for whom the effects have been deeply damaging and who continue to be felt today. And all of you who are intergenerational survivors, the children, the grandchildren, the nephews, the nieces of residential school survivors, put your hands up. Let me see you. Thank you as well for coming forward and sharing your stories with us. And everybody acknowledge them as well. Over the period of time that the schools were in existence, from the 1870s until the last school closed in 1996, 7 generations of children went through those schools. 7 generations of children were damaged by the schools that were put in place. If those schools had only been there for 10 or 20 years or 30 years, 1, 2 generations, the children probably could have recovered. We wouldn't be talking of this magnitude as we are today. But after a period of time, the children who were being returned from the schools were going back to communities and to families who themselves had been damaged by the schools. And so the ability of those communities to help those children to recover and to heal from what they had experienced in the schools became less and less. The ability to use cultural activities became weaker and weaker. The ability to use language and to retain the strength of their history and to pass that along became lost to each succeeding generation. Removed from their families and from their home communities, 7 generations of children now have lost their identity. And so the intergenerational survivors who are here today will tell you that many of them do not know how to speak their language, and they regret that. Many of them do not know their full cultural teachings, were not born with the knowledge of that history, do not know the full story of all of their heroes, do not know what their ancestors wanted them to understand about the treaties or about the experiences that they had at the time of contact, to their regret. But they are now learning. They are now learning about those things, despite the fact that they were separated from their language, their culture, their spiritual traditions, and their collective histories. And despite the fact that these children have been unable to answer the questions of life that we all are faced with. Where do I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? And who am I? They are now beginning to find those elders who can help them do those things. And for that we are all very lucky. All of us, because now they will bring that knowledge forward as well. Those fundamental questions are very important for all of us as we go forward. They guide us in life, they influence our choices, they strengthen our ability to take advantage of all of the opportunities that we are faced with, and they help us to find and fulfill our sense of self and our responsibility to the community, to society. Survivors were stripped of the ability to answer those questions. They were stripped as well of the love of their families. They were stripped of their self-respect. And we can see now how such systemic abuse continues to echo through the generations. One survivor, when sharing her story with us, said, "I don't know how to love. I didn't learn how to love while I was in those schools." And you think about that. What must that be like, to not know how to love your own children, to be afraid to touch and to hold them and to carry them? So I challenge you all to reflect on how such an ability would impact on your life, and how the lives of all of those around you would be impacted as well, and how that would change the way that we behaved towards and about each other. Make no mistake about this, residential schools were no less than a systematic and concerted attempt to extinguish the spirit of Aboriginal peoples. You will have heard that the Chief Justice of Canada the other day said residential schools were cultural genocide. I can't say that word yet, but I might be able to soon. So I want you to know that when someone in that position of that significance in society uses a phrase like that, that individual gets it. That individual understands the magnitude of the problem that we are talking about. One final word about our full and final report. When we are finished with it, we have made a commitment to the survivors that we will also ensure that we produce a report that's in the languages of the survivors who have spoken to us. We have made a commitment not only to translate it into French and English, but also we are going to be recording an oral version of the full report in 6 Aboriginal languages so that elders will be able to listen. for one, will tell you, after spending so much time writing it, that's how I'm going to listen to it. We have a lot of work to do as a society. We have a great deal of distance to cover. 7 generations of damage has occurred. Reconciliation will not be achieved in my lifetime. I've said that before. Reconciliation will probably not be achieved in the lifetime of my children. But reconciliation will be achieved if we understand this. You do not have to believe that reconciliation will happen. You have to believe that reconciliation should happen.